The morning sun streamed through the curtains as she prepared breakfast, humming softly to herself. Life felt good. She had a loving husband, a best friend who had been like a sister to her, and a home that felt warm and safe. She never imagined that the two people she trusted the most would shatter her world in a way she could never have anticipated. Her husband had been acting a little different lately, but she convinced herself it was just the stress of work. He came home later than usual, claiming he had extra meetings. His phone, which was once left casually on the kitchen counter, now never left his side. When she asked him about it, he brushed off her concerns with a laugh and a kiss on her forehead. "You worry too much," he told her. "I love you, you know that." She smiled, pushing away the unease in her chest. Love was about trust, and she trusted him completely. Her best friend, too, had been distant. They used to talk for hours, sharing their deepest fears and dreams. Lately, though, her friend was always busy. When they did meet, there was an odd nervousness in her eyes, a hesitation in her voice that the protagonist could not quite place. But she dismissed it, telling herself that people go through phases. Maybe her friend was dealing with personal struggles she was not ready to share. She would wait, as a good friend should. The little signs continued to build up, but love has a way of blinding people. She did not question why her husband suddenly seemed to avoid intimate conversations, or why he no longer reached for her hand when they sat together on the couch. She ignored the way her best friend flinched when their eyes met, or how she always had an excuse to leave early. The truth was right in front of her, but she did not want to see it. Then, one evening, everything changed. She had just returned from the grocery store when she saw her husband sitting on the couch, his hands buried in his hair. Her best friend stood nearby, avoiding her gaze. There was a thick silence in the room, heavy and suffocating. Something was wrong. "What is going on?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing fear in her chest. Her husband looked up at her. His eyes filled with something she had never seen before: guilt. Her best friend shifted uncomfortably, biting her lip. "I need to tell you something," her husband said, his voice barely above a whisper. She felt her heart pound against her ribs. "Then tell me," she said, trying to ignore the way her stomach twisted. Her best friend took a shaky breath and finally met her eyes. "I am pregnant." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Pregnant. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. She turned to her husband, searching his face for an explanation, for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. But he would not look at her. Her hands trembled. "How?" The question died in her throat as realization dawned. Her best friend was pregnant. And it was not just any man's child. It was her husband's. The world around her seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. She felt sick, like she could not breathe. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This cannot be happening." "I am sorry," her best friend said, her voice breaking. "Sorry." She let out a hollow laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You are sorry." She turned to her husband, anger and pain swirling together in her chest. "How long?" He swallowed hard. "A few months." "A few months," she repeated, as if saying it aloud would make it easier to process. But it did not. It only made the betrayal cut deeper. Memories flashed through her mind. The nights he came home late, the way he pulled away when she reached for him, the stolen glances between him and her best friend that she had been too blind to see for what they were. It had all been right there, and she had ignored it. Her legs felt weak, and she reached for the wall to steady herself. The room blurred as tears filled her eyes. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her husband stood, reaching for her, but she stepped back as if his touch would burn her. "Do not," she warned, her voice shaking. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I never meant for this to happen." She let out a bitter laugh. "You never meant for this to happen. You cheated on me with my best friend, and now she is carrying your child. But you never meant for it to happen." She wiped angrily at the tears on her face. "Was it a mistake? An accident? Did you trip and fall into bed with her?" Her best friend flinched at the harshness of her words, but she did not care. "Please," her husband said, his voice desperate now. "We did not want to hurt you." She stared at him, at the man she had loved, the man she had trusted with everything. "But you did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did hurt me. And you did not just hurt me. You destroyed me." Her chest ached as sobs threatened to break free. She had spent years building a life with him, believing in their love, only to have it ripped apart in the cruelest way possible. And the worst part, the betrayal did not come from a stranger. Came from the two people she had loved the most. She turned and walked toward the door, needing to escape, to breathe, to get away from the suffocating presence of their betrayal. "Where are you going?" her husband called after her. She did not turn back. "Away from you." And with that, she stepped out of the house, leaving behind the life she thought she knew, the love she thought was real, and the people she thought would never betray her. The pain was unbearable, but she knew one thing. She could never look at them the same way again. She sat in her darkened bedroom, staring at the ceiling as the weight of everything pressed down on her chest. Sleep did not come easily anymore. When she closed her eyes, all she could see was their faces. His face, the man she had loved and trusted, and hers, the woman who had once been her closest friend. Their voices echoed in her mind, their confessions replaying over and over again, like a cruel song she could not turn off. The pain was unbearable. It sat deep inside her, clawing at her heart, making it difficult to breathe. She had heard stories of betrayal before, had seen it happen to others, but she never imagined she would be the one left shattered. She had been a good wife. She had loved him unconditionally, supported him through everything. She had never once doubted their love. And now she questioned everything. Had she been foolish? Had she been too blind, too trusting? What was wrong with her that he had chosen someone else? What was it about her best friend that made him betray their vows? The questions tormented her, but there were no answers, only a gaping void that filled her with sorrow. She remembered the first time she met him. It had been a rainy afternoon, and she had been running late for a meeting. He had bumped into her accidentally, spilling coffee on her coat. Flustered and apologetic, he had insisted on buying her a new one. She had laughed it off, finding his nervous charm endearing. From that moment on, he had pursued her relentlessly, making her feel like she was the only woman in the world. And she had believed it. Their love had felt real, solid, unbreakable. Every anniversary, every whispered promise, every night spent in each other's arms, it had all felt like forever. But forever had turned out to be temporary. He had looked her in the eyes and told her she was the love of his life, only to turn around and give himself to another woman. And not just any woman. Her best friend. She wiped a tear from her cheek, though it did nothing to stop the flood that followed. The memories were too painful. She thought about all the times her best friend had sat beside her, laughing, sharing secrets, telling her how lucky she was to have such a devoted husband. And the entire time she had been stabbing her in the back. Had there been signs? Yes, there had been. But she had ignored them, convinced that love and friendship were enough to overcome anything. She had been wrong. Days passed in a blur. She barely ate. The house felt empty, the silence unbearable. She tried to distract herself, but nothing worked. Every corner held a memory. Every room whispered their betrayal. The kitchen where she had cooked meals for him, the couch where they had curled up on lazy Sundays, the bedroom where they had once whispered dreams about the future. It all felt tainted now. One evening, when she finally gathered enough strength to leave the house, she ran into him. He stood there on the sidewalk, looking at her as if he had been waiting. There was no shame in his eyes, only frustration. "We need to talk," he said. She stared at him, her heart aching at how familiar he still looked. How could he stand there so casually, as if he had not destroyed her? She wanted to scream at him to demand answers, but all she managed to say was, "Why?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You have to understand, things were not working between us." She blinked, stunned by his words. "Not working." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Since when? You were distant," he continued. "You were always so caught up in your own world. I felt like I was losing you." Her breath caught in her throat. "I was distant." She took a step closer, her hands shaking. "I loved you. I gave you everything I had. And you think I was distant?" He looked away, as if he could not handle the pain in her eyes. "I did not mean for it to happen this way. You did not mean for it to happen." She let out a hollow laugh, one that held no humor. "You had a choice. You could have talked to me. You could have ended things before cheating on me. But instead, you betrayed me with the one person I trusted the most." "She was there for me," he muttered, and those words cut deeper than any knife. She took a step back, as if physically recoiling from his presence. "And I was not." He had no answer. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. "Do you love her?" she asked, forcing herself to hold his gaze. He hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. He had destroyed their marriage for something he was not even sure about. She turned away, unwilling to listen to another word. Days passed, and she tried to stay strong, but the pain was relentless. Her best friend had not reached out, not even once. The silence was deafening, confirming what she already knew. She had lost them both. Then one afternoon she heard the news. They were moving in together. Her stomach twisted, nausea creeping up her throat. Too soon. They had not even tried to hide it. They had not even given her the time to heal before shoving their new life in her face. She could picture it too clearly. Her best friend in their kitchen, her laughter echoing through the halls, her husband holding her the way he used to hold her. The same hands that had once traced her skin now belonged to another. The same love he had sworn was eternal had been given to someone else. Her chest ached so deeply she thought it might crush her. She had never felt so alone. Nights were the worst. She would lie in bed, staring at the empty space beside her, remembering the warmth that once filled it. She would reach out, only to be met with cold sheets. She stopped answering calls. She stopped leaving the house. The world outside felt too cruel, too loud. She was drowning, but no one seemed to notice. She wanted to scream. She wanted to disappear. But deep inside, buried beneath the pain, was a small ember of something else. Something that had not fully taken shape yet. Not anger. Not hatred. Something stronger. Something that whispered, "This is not the end." The first thing she noticed was the warmth of the morning sun on her skin. It was gentle, almost comforting, unlike the cold emptiness she had grown used to. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she expected to see the same broken world she had left behind. But something was different. The air smelled fresher, lighter, untouched by the bitterness that had suffocated her for so long. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The room around her was familiar. Too familiar. The soft lilac curtains, the slightly chipped nightstand, the framed picture on the wall of her younger self smiling at a world that had not yet betrayed her. This could not be real. She turned, her hands gripping the sheets, expecting the cold emptiness of her marriage bed. But it was not there. Instead, she was in her old bedroom, the one she had lived in before she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Her breath hitched. She scrambled out of bed, rushing to the mirror. What she saw sent a shockwave through her body. The face staring back at her was hers, but younger. No dark circles, no lines carved by grief. Her eyes, once dull with heartbreak, were bright and full of life again. She stepped back, hands trembling. This was impossible. A dream. A cruel trick of the mind. But then she saw the calendar on her desk, the date clear as day. It was years before everything had fallen apart. Her knees nearly gave out. Somehow, someway she had been given a second chance. A sharp breath left her lips. The memories came flooding back. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the moment she had learned that the people she loved most had destroyed her. She remembered the nights she had cried herself to sleep, the pain that had nearly consumed her. And now, here she was, standing on the edge of it all before it ever happened. A slow realization spread through her like fire. This time she would not be the same woman. She clenched her fists, feeling something inside her shift. The naive girl who had blindly trusted, who had given her heart so easily, was gone. She would not be deceived again. She would not love him. She would not trust her so-called best friend. They had stolen so much from her in another life, but in this one, she would be the one in control. She would not waste her time mourning what had not yet been lost. No, she had more important things to do. She had herself to rebuild. A small, almost bitter smile touched her lips. She had spent so long searching for the reason she had not been enough. But now she knew the truth. It had never been about her being unworthy. It had been about them never deserving her in the first place. She straightened her spine. She would not let herself fall for sweet words and empty promises. She would not let herself be fooled by love that was never real. This time she would be stronger. This time she would be ready. She stood in front of the mirror, smoothing out the fabric of her dress, carefully schooling her expression into one of soft warmth. The girl looking back at her was not the same one from her past life. That girl had been blind, trusting, too full of love for people who had never deserved it. But now, her love was nothing more than an illusion, a carefully crafted mask that hid the fire burning beneath her skin. When she stepped out of her room, she found him waiting for her. The man who had once shattered her into pieces. He smiled at her, the same charming smile that had once made her heart flutter. Now, it barely stirred anything in her. "You look beautiful," he said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. She forced herself to smile, to let her gaze soften as though she still loved him. "You always say that," she murmured, letting herself fall into the role she needed to play. He chuckled, slipping his arm around her waist as if he had any right to touch her. "Because it is always true." She had fallen for them once. She would not again. For now she would pretend. She would let him believe that she was still the same woman who would do anything for him. That she was still the fool who had placed her entire world in his hands, trusting him not to break it. But while he remained unaware, she was already laying the foundation for his downfall. She reached out to her best friend, the woman who had betrayed her so cruelly. It took every ounce of restraint not to let her disgust show when they met. Instead, she smiled, laughed at the right moments, let her believe that their friendship was untouched, still strong. And the woman fell for it just like before. The signs were there, just as they had been in her past life. The lingering glances between them when they thought she was not looking. The way they exchanged knowing smiles, believing themselves to be clever. They thought they were fooling her. But this time she was the one pulling the strings. She listened carefully, catching every whispered conversation, every moment that hinted at their hidden betrayal. And she started to plant seeds of her own. Small subtle things. Passing comment here, a well-placed question there. Enough to make her so-called best friend second-guess herself, to make her nervous, to make her slip up. She never confronted them outright. That would be too easy, too simple. No, she wanted them to unravel on their own, to feel the walls closing in without understanding how or why. She let her best friend believe she was confiding in her. "I think he has been acting a little strange lately," she murmured one evening, pretending to be troubled. "Do you think something is wrong?" Her best friend hesitated, but only for a moment. "I am sure it is nothing," she said too quickly, her voice a little too forced. She smiled inwardly but only nodded. "Maybe you are right." That was all she needed to plant. The more she played innocent, the more careless they became. She started keeping records. Messages, calls, conversations that would eventually serve as undeniable proof. Every time they met in secret, she found a way to be nearby, listening, watching, collecting every piece of evidence she needed. And while they remained tangled in their deceit, she was quietly building herself up. She focused on her career, something she had neglected in her past life because she had been too wrapped up in love, too busy trying to be the perfect wife. Not this time. She worked harder, investing in herself, creating opportunities that would allow her to walk away from this marriage with her head held high and her future secured. And with every success she achieved, She felt the power shift. She was no longer the woman who had been discarded and left broken. She was the woman who would decide when the game ended. And when the time was right, she would make sure they both paid for what they had done. The evening was perfect, the air filled with laughter and the soft clinking of glasses. People moved through the grand hall, exchanging pleasantries, lost in conversations that held no real weight. It was an event designed to impress, a gathering of influential people, and her husband had insisted on bringing her. He stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, the way it always had. To anyone watching, they were the perfect couple, a vision of love and devotion. No one would have guessed the truth lurking beneath the surface. She had planned this night carefully, every detail set in place, every step leading to this exact moment. She had waited patiently, playing her role flawlessly, letting them believe she was still blind, still devoted, still unaware. But now the game was coming to an end. The room buzzed with idle conversation, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and fine wine. She spotted her best friend across the room, laughing softly, her gaze flickering towards him in that same secretive way. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she saw it. She saw everything. Her husband leaned in, whispering something into her ear. His voice filled with feigned warmth. "You seem distracted." She turned to him, offering a small smile. "Just thinking about how special tonight is." And it was. Just not in the way he expected. She took a step forward, letting her heels click against the marble floor, drawing just enough attention as she made her way to the center of the room. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the exhilaration of knowing that this was the moment she would finally be free. She reached for the microphone, her voice steady as she spoke. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It truly means a lot to my husband and me." She turned slightly, meeting his gaze just as a flicker of confusion crossed his face. "But let him wonder. Let him feel it creeping in. I have always believed that love is built on trust, on loyalty, on the belief that the person you choose will stand by your side no matter what. And I was lucky," she continued, her voice smooth, unwavering. "Lucky enough to find a husband who promised me forever. A best friend who swore she would always be there for me." The room was silent now, the shift in atmosphere almost tangible. But promises mean nothing when they are made by people who never intended to keep them. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, curiosity turning into unease. Her husband took a step forward, his expression tense. "What are you doing?" She ignored him, reaching into her pocket and pulling out her phone. The screen lit up, and within seconds, the projector behind her came to life. The first messages appeared. Her husband's words, affectionate, desperate, begging for moments with a woman who was supposed to be her best friend. Gasps filled the room. The texts kept coming, each one more damning than the last. Sneaky meetings, stolen moments, whispered lies. The betrayal spilled onto the screen for everyone to see. She heard the sharp intake of breath from her best friend, the way her face drained of color as the weight of their actions crashed down around them. "You should stop this," her husband hissed, reaching for her arm. She pulled away, her voice cutting through the silence. "Why? Do you not want them to see what you have done? Do you not want them to know how you betrayed me in the worst possible way?" A video played next, a grainy but clear recording of them together, unaware they were being watched. Whispers turned into sharp accusations, the judgment in the room almost suffocating. Their carefully built facade crumbled, and there was no way to piece it back together. Her best friend stepped forward, her voice trembling. I can explain." "Explain what?" She let out a cold laugh. "That you lied to my face. That you pretended to be my friend while sneaking around with my husband." Tears welled in her best friend's eyes, but there was no sympathy left to offer. Her husband turned desperate now, reaching for her, his voice low. "We can fix this. We can talk about it." She took a step back, shaking her head. "No. There is nothing left to fix." The humiliation burned on their faces, the realization sinking in that there was no coming back from this. The people around them looked at them differently now. Not with admiration but with disgust. She turned without another word, walking away from both of them, from everything they had ruined. She did not need revenge beyond this. She had won. The days that followed were quiet, but they were not empty. For the first time in years, she was not consumed by pain or betrayal. She was not lost in the shadows of what had been done to her. She was simply herself, standing at the edge of something new, something untouched by the past. She woke up each morning without the weight of a loveless marriage pressing down on her chest. She no longer had to pretend, to force herself to smile through the pain of deception. Instead, she stretched, breathed in the fresh air, and reminded herself that she was free. But freedom did not mean she had everything figured out. She had spent so long wrapped up in the illusion of love that she had forgotten what it meant to live for herself. She had given pieces of herself away, chipping away at her own dreams, her own ambitions, until there had been nothing left but the shell of a woman who had once believed in forever. That was no longer who she was. She started small. Mornings became moments of peace, spent sipping coffee in the quiet of her own space, no longer rushing to make someone else's life easier while neglecting her own. She started reading again, something she had abandoned long ago in favor of making sure her husband was always comfortable, always cared for. Then came the bigger steps. She went back to work with a new sense of purpose, throwing herself into projects that challenged her, that reminded her of her own intelligence, her own capability. She started taking courses, learning new skills, expanding her horizons in ways she had never thought possible when she had been stuck in a life where she was always second to someone else. And along the way she met people, real people. People who did not pretend, who did not use love as a weapon. They did not whisper false promises into her ear or smile at her while stabbing her in the back. These people laughed with her, encouraged her, reminded her that she was more than just a woman who had been betrayed. She found herself smiling without effort, without pretense. Healing was not linear. Some days, the ghosts of the past crept in, whispering doubts, trying to pull her back into the pain she had fought so hard to leave behind. But she refused to let them take root. She acknowledged them, faced them head-on, and then let them go. She learned to love herself again, to look in the mirror and see more than just the woman who had been left behind. She saw strength. She saw resilience. She saw someone who had walked through the fire and had not let it destroy her. Forgiveness was harder. Not for them. They did not deserve it. But for herself. She forgave herself for trusting too easily, for loving too deeply, for not seeing the signs when they had been right in front of her. She forgave herself for staying when she should have left, for mourning people who had never truly loved her the way she had loved them. She did not forget. She never would. But she no longer let it define her. And while she was rising, while she was building something better, something stronger, the ones who had tried to break her were falling apart. The world had not been kind to them after the truth had come out. The shame, the judgment, the loss of respect from those they had once surrounded themselves with. It all came crashing down. They had built their lives on lies. And now, the foundation was crumbling beneath them. Her ex-husband struggled. No longer the admired man he had once pretended to be. His charm had lost its power. His reputation tainted by his own selfishness. The people who had once praised him now whispered behind his back, their admiration turning to scorn. And her former best friend. She had not fared much better. Whatever fantasy she had imagined, whatever twisted idea of happiness she had thought she would find in betrayal, had quickly turned to dust. They had each other now, but they no longer had the world's favor. And most importantly, they no longer had her. She did not look back. She did not need to. Her future was ahead of her, waiting. And this time, it belonged to her alone. She did not seek revenge. She did not have to. The universe had a way of balancing things out. And now, it was working in ways she could never have imagined. The news reached her in passing, whispered by those who had once praised the couple who betrayed her. She did not ask for details, but they came to her anyway, carried by the very people who had once turned a blind eye to the deception. Her former best friend was not glowing with happiness the way she had imagined she would be. There were no fairy tale endings, No stolen love story that blossomed into something beautiful. Instead, cracks had formed in the perfect image she had tried to create. And now, those cracks were growing wider, exposing the truth beneath. The husband, the man she had stolen, was cheating on her. It was almost poetic, the way the betrayal had come full circle. The same lies, the same secrecy, the same whispered excuses. She had once laughed behind closed doors, believing she had won some great prize, believing she had taken something precious from someone else. Now, she was the one crying in the darkness, feeling the sting of disloyalty. The ex-husband had not changed. He had never been capable of true love, only possession. He had taken what he wanted and discarded what no longer served him. And now, with nothing left to distract him, he had turned his attention back to the one thing he had lost forever. He tried to reach out first with simple messages. Apologies laced with regret. Reminders of their past. Promises that things could be different. She ignored them. Then came the bolder attempts. He showed up unexpectedly, finding excuses to be near her. He spoke of mistakes, of how he had been blind to what he had before. He told her he missed her, that he had been wrong, that no one could ever compare to her. She looked at him and for the first time she felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even satisfaction, just indifference. She had spent so much of her life wrapped up in his lies, drowning in the pain of his betrayal, waiting for the day he would feel the same devastation he had caused her. And now that it was here, it did not matter. His regret, his suffering, his downfall, none of it had any power over her anymore. She did not need revenge. She did not need to see him suffer to feel whole again. She had already won. She had built a life that was hers alone, filled with success, with purpose, with genuine connections. She had risen from the ashes of what they had destroyed and had created something stronger, something untouchable. While they crumbled under the weight of their own choices, she soared. She had moved on not because she had to, but because she had chosen to. And that, she realized, was the sweetest revenge of all. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and violet. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, and for the first time in a long while, she felt completely at peace. Life had changed in ways she never imagined. Not because of revenge, not because of the pain she had endured, but because she had chosen to heal. She had chosen to move forward, to create a life where her happiness was not tied to anyone but herself. And in that journey, she had found love again. It had not happened overnight. She had been hesitant, wary of opening her heart again, unsure if she could ever truly trust someone. But he had been patient. He had never rushed her, never demanded more than she was willing to give. He had simply been there, steady and unwavering, showing her what love was supposed to feel like. With him, there were no mind games, no hidden betrayals, no whispered lies behind her back. He saw her for who she was, not as someone to control or possess, but as a partner, an equal. She had thought love was something she had lost forever. But now, as she stood beside him, fingers intertwined, she realized love had never truly left her. It had only been waiting for her to find herself first. And now she was whole. She had one last encounter with her past. Not because she needed it, but because life had a way of bringing things full circle. She saw her ex-husband and former best friend at an event, their presence nothing more than a distant echo of a life she no longer belonged to. He looked tired, the weight of his choices evident in the way his shoulders sagged. She could see the regret in his eyes, the silent plea for something that would never return. Her former best friend looked just as lost, the glow of stolen happiness long faded. They did not approach her, but she could feel their stares. Once she would have broken at the sight of them, would have felt a storm of emotions, pain, anger, sadness. But as she stood there, dressed in confidence, love beside her, a future ahead of her, she felt nothing. She had already left them behind. She turned away, walking forward without a single glance back. She was free. Her past did not define her. Her pain did not define her. She had built something greater, something stronger, and no one could take that from her. As she stepped into the light of her new beginning, she knew that her story was no longer about betrayal or heartbreak. It was about resilience. It was about self-worth. And it was about moving forward, unshaken, unstoppable. True strength is not in seeking revenge, but in rising above betrayal, finding self-worth, and embracing a future that is truly your own.